You use it all the time, probably without thinking about where it comes from. An Achilles heel. The one fatal weakness in something otherwise strong, the flaw in the powerful company, the vulnerability in the unbeatable team, the single crack that brings the whole thing down. It is one of the most useful phrases in the language, and everyone knows the story behind it. The greatest warrior of the Trojan War, invulnerable everywhere except one spot on his heel, killed by an arrow to the only place he could be hurt. It is a perfect story. Clean, ironic, unforgettable. The mightiest man alive, undone by the 1 inch of him his mother forgot to protect. And it is not an HOHmer, not a word of it. Not the invulnerability, not the dip in the magic river, not the heel, not the arrow to the heel. You can read the entire Iliad, all 24 books, the greatest poem ever written about Achilles, the work that made him immortal in the other sense, and you will not find a single line suggesting he cannot be wounded, or that he has one weak spot, or that anyone ever dipped him in anything. The Achilles of HOHmer bleeds. The Achilles of HOHmer can die and knows it, and that knowledge is the whole point of him. The invincible warrior with the fatal heel is a much later invention, stitched together across 1,000 years, finished by a Roman, and in some ways never quite finished at all. And when you see where it actually came from, and what it replaced, you realize the most famous weakness in history is not just historically wrong. It quietly destroys the very thing that made Achilles the most tragic hero the Greeks ever created. Here is the version everyone carries, and it is genuinely elegant, which is part of the problem. Achilles is the son of a goddess, the sea nymph Theaetetus, and a mortal king. And Theaetetus knows, because prophecy runs all through this family, that her son is fated to die young at Troy. So she tries to cheat it. She takes the infant Achilles down to the River Styx, the river that borders the underworld itself, whose black water makes flesh invulnerable, and she dips him in. She holds him by one heel and plunges the rest of him under, so that every part of him touched by the water becomes proof against any weapon. He grows up unkillable. Spears break on him, arrows bounce off. He walks through the deadliest war of the age untouched, a man who simply cannot be harmed. Except for that one heel, the place her fingers covered, the one spot the water never reached, the size of a thumbprint, the single flaw in an otherwise perfect defense. And at the end of the war, the Trojan Prince Paris, not even a great warrior, an archer, a lover more than a fighter, looses an arrow, and the god Apollo guides it, and it finds the one place on Achilles' whole body that can be pierced, the heel. And the greatest warrior who ever lived drops dead, killed through the only inch of him his mother's hand had shadowed. It is so tidy it feels ancient, feels like it must go all the way back. We even named a part of the human body after it, the Achilles tendon, the cord at the back of your heel, carries the myth in the anatomy textbook. The phrase, the tendon, the story. It is woven so deep into the culture that it seems impossible it was ever not there. But go to the source. Go to the oldest and greatest telling, and it simply is not. Open the Iliad, and the Achilles you meet is a completely different creature from the invulnerable man of the legend. He is mortal fully, dangerously mortal. HOHmer's Achilles can be hurt. He bleeds. Other fighters wound each other constantly in the poem, and nothing marks Achilles as immune. There is no river, no dip, no charmed skin. Theaetetus never takes him to the Styx. The single most famous fact about Achilles, that he was invulnerable, does not exist anywhere in the poem that is supposedly about him. Homer either had never heard of it or did not want it, and given how central it would have been, the likeliest answer is that in Homer's world the story simply did not exist yet. And here is why that matters, because it is not a missing detail. It is the removal of the entire tragedy. The Achilles of the Iliad is defined by one thing above all. He knows he is going to die. His mother, the goddess, has told him plainly, and she has told him something worse, that he has a choice. Homer lays it out in his own words. Achilles has two fates, two threads he can follow. If he leaves Troy now and sails home, he will live a long, quiet, comfortable life and die old and be forgotten completely, his name vanishing like everyone else's. Or he can stay and fight and die young on the plain of Troy and be remembered forever, his glory sung for 3,000 years. One or the other. Long life and oblivion, or early death and undying fame. That is the real engine of the Iliad, and it has nothing to do with a heel. Achilles is not a man who cannot be killed. He is a man who has been told exactly how and when he will be killed, and who chooses to walk toward it anyway, with his eyes open, in exchange for glory. When he goes back into battle to avenge his friend Patroclus, he knows Homer has him say it out loud that killing Achilles means his own death will follow almost immediately. His mother warns him one last time, and he does it anyway. He trades his life knowingly for a name that will outlast him. Even his horse, Zan, thus, given a voice by the gods, turns and prophesies his master's death to his face, and Achilles answers that he already knows and rides out regardless. There is no invulnerability in any of this. There is something far more powerful, a man who is completely capable of dying, who has been told he will die, and who chooses the death because the alternative is to be nobody. Take that away, make him unkillable except for a technicality, and you have not simplified the story. You have deleted the reason it is great. Stay with that choice for a moment, because it is one of the most extraordinary things in all of ancient literature, and the heel legend runs directly over the top of it. The Greek word underneath the whole poem is kleos. It means glory, but more precisely it means the fame that gets sung, your name carried forward in poetry, kept alive in the mouths of people who will never meet you, long after your body is gone. To a Greek hero, kleos was the only immortality available. There was no happy afterlife waiting. The Greek underworld is a gray, joyless place of drifting shadows. The only way to survive death at all was to do something so great that the poets would keep saying your name. And Achilles makes the most naked possible version of that bargain. He spends his single mortal life to buy the one immortality there is. He dies so the song will exist. The song is this. You are right now. Part of the reason he made the right call 3,000 years later, we are still saying his name. And Homer drives the tragedy of it home from beyond the grave. In the Odyssey, Odysseus goes down to the land of the dead, and there among the shades he meets Achilles dead, exactly as chosen, glorious forever. And Odysseus tries to comfort him. You must be at peace. You are honored like a god among the dead." And Achilles cuts him off and says one of the most devastating things anyone says in Hohmer. "Do not try to sell me death," he says. "I would rather be alive, a landless servant, a hired hand working the fields of some poor man with nothing, than be king over all the perished dead." The man who chose glory over life, looking back from the other side, says he chose wrong, that the life he threw away was worth more than the fame he bought. That is a real ending. It is complicated and painful, and it asks you whether the whole heroic bargain was ever worth it. Now set the heel next to that. In the popular version, Achilles does not choose anything. He is unkillable, coasting through the war untouchable, and then he dies because his mum missed a spot. His death is not a decision. It is an accident of anatomy. There is no bargain, no knowledge, no walking open-eyed toward a foreseen end. The heel keeps the drama of one fatal weakness and throws away the far deeper drama of a man who had no weakness except being human, and who spent his humanity on purpose. It trades a tragedy for a technicality. So where did the heel come from, if not from Hohmer? The dip in the Styx, the actual scene, the goddess holding the baby by the ankle over the black water, comes from a Roman poet named Statius, writing in Latin around the year 95 of the Common Era. That is not a small gap. That is more than 1,000 years after Hohmer. Statius wrote an epic called the Iliad, and he never even finished it. He died with the poem barely begun. But in the part he did write, there is Theaetetus, dipping her infant son in the underworld river to make him invulnerable, holding him by the heel. That is the birth of the image, and it is Roman, and it is late, and it belongs to a completely different world from the Greek one that made the Iliad. And here is the part almost nobody knows, the twist inside the twist. Even Statius does not finish the logic. He never actually says the heel is the one place Achilles can be killed. He never stages the arrow finding it. The neat, ironic ending, Paris shooting Achilles precisely in the unprotected heel, is not even in Statius. It gets bolted on later still, by even later writers, filling in the obvious gap the story seemed to demand. So the Achilles heel, as we know it, does not come from any single ancient source at all. It is a composite, assembled across centuries. A Roman poet who added the dip, later hands who added the fatal arrow, folklore smoothing it into the tidy shape we inherited. No Greek wrote it. No one in the ancient world wrote all of it. The reason it won is the reason every one of these flattened versions wins. Invulnerable except for one secret spot is one of the most powerful story shapes there is. It turns up again and again across the world's mythologies. The hero with a single hidden weakness, because it is unbearably suspenseful and effortless to remember. It is a fairy tale mechanism, and it is stronger as a hook than the thing Hohmer actually wrote. A man who could die knew it and chose to is deep, but it is not a riddle, not a gotcha, not a single glittering image you can hold in one hand. So the culture kept the glittering image and quietly discarded the philosophy underneath, the same way it kept the mermaid and lost the Eswyran's knowledge, kept the box and lost Pandora's jar. The vivid thing survives. The meaning goes overboard. So is the Achilles heel real. As a phrase, it is wonderful, and it is not going anywhere, and there is no reason it should. But as a piece of Greek myth, it is a latecomer wearing an ancient costume, a Roman dip, a medieval arrow, a fairy tale weakness. None of it HOH-mers, all of it arriving centuries after the story it attached itself to. The real Achilles, the one in the oldest and greatest version, has no magic skin and no secret flaw. He has something much harder to look at: a normal mortal body, a certain early death, full knowledge of that death, and the choice to walk into it for the sake of a song. And that is what the heel quietly costs us. It takes the most agonizing decision in Greek literature. Is a short, blazing life worth more than a long, forgotten one? And it replaces that decision with a household accident. It makes Achilles safe, and then unlucky, when the entire power of him is that he was never safe and never unlucky. He was doomed, and he knew it, and he went anyway. We remember him as the man who was invincible except in one place. He was really the man who was vincible everywhere and chose to die regardless. That second man is braver and sadder and far more worth 3,000 years of remembering than the first. There is one more thing the legend skips, and it is where the real story goes next. When Achilles finally does fall at Troy, killed exactly as he chose to be, he leaves behind the armor the god Hephaestus forged for him. A shield with the whole world hammered into it, the most beautiful object in the war. And the question of who deserves to inherit that armor, of which of the surviving heroes has earned the dead man's glory, will drive the single greatest of them into a madness that ends with his own sword in the sand. But that, the fight over a dead man's shield, and the hero it destroyed, is a tale for another night.